Well, thank you, George, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's been particularly interesting to see quite a number of other speakers. Pesticides have come up as an issue. I've counted at least 4 times it's come up in other talks, so I think this is a very timely opportunity. So these are my disclosures, and what I'm going to talk to you today about is really my own personal views, and they may not necessarily reflect the organisations that I'm associated with. So these are some of the things I'm hoping to cover, questions and issues, but the main focus is really going to be on what's been happening in Australia and what we can do right now to actually start making a difference. So like many of you in the room, when I was diagnosed in 2018, I wanted to really find out why I have PD. A couple of years ago I had a genetic panel, and I've got 4 minor genetic abnormalities, including a PINK1 variant that apparently, according to the people who know, are individually not significant, but perhaps in combination or with the addition of an exposure, it might well be relevant. And I'd long wondered if some possible exposures I'd had in childhood could perhaps be relevant to my own case. And my dad was a school teacher, and we actually moved around rural Western Australia before settling back in Perth in the late 1970s. I did kindergarten in Kambalda, which is a nickel mining town, and nickel is on the list of heavy metals that's potentially implicated. We then spent 3 years in the heart of the West Australian wheat belt, and our house was immediately next to a wheat field. We also had some relatives who are farmers, and when we moved to the city, we'd often go back for school holidays, and even when I was at university, I'd sometimes go to my uncle's farm to do some manual labouring to earn a bit of extra pocket money. But these childhood exposures were not the only potential exposure. I've been a very avid golfer for 50 years now, and I spent an awful lot of time on fairways and in the rough where all sorts of chemicals have been sprayed, and that's me in action over here. And you can see a little puff of sand coming up, and if there's some chemicals on the ground, you're potentially in trouble. Perhaps the most ironic exposure I had was last year. I was very fortunate to play in Ireland in the Irish Open Championships for people with Parkinsons, which is a fantastic event, but unbelievably, our round was briefly interrupted. They came on the course to do some spraying, and we were looking at each other going, how can that be? And I've also lived for the last 17 years about 300 metres away from a major golf course in Perth, and there's a study that shows that people living downwind of golf courses have an increased risk of Parkinson's. And finally, here's a picture of there's a wetlands next to my house, and 100 metres from my door, this is the local council putting out their sign for glyphosate or Roundup, and that's 100 metres from my door. So, and I guess the other thing I wanted to say was that I picked up some dry cleaning last week, and we know that trichloroethylene has been used in dry cleaning processes. So the reason I mention all of this is that it's an illustration of the complexities of this field when you're trying to look to see if a single agent or specific exposure is contributing to a complex and variable disease like Parkinson's disease, because I don't know what I've potentially been exposed to or what dose I've been exposed to, and that creates all this uncertainty. But nonetheless, there have been some culprits in terms of environmental toxins that have been separated from the pack, including paraquat. And so this is paraquat. It's a chemical formula. It's a very powerful oxidant. So you've obviously heard of people who understand what antioxidants are, And paraquat's pretty much the opposite of that. So the way it works is that it supercharges the mechanisms that focus on the mitochondrial energy production. And in plants, it damages the mechanisms for plants to actually photosynthesize. So that makes it really quite a potent way of killing weeds. And it's particularly useful for weeds that have developed a resistance to less strong methods of killing, so herbicides. The acute effects of paraquat are tremendous, and this is a sign taken from the EPA of America's website about one sip can kill. It has a terrible erosive effect on the esophagus, and acutely it has terrible inflammation of the lungs. This is so we'll just go back. So this is a CT scan of the chest, and the lung should be all black like the trachea is here with air, and all this white stuff is acute inflammation. And the mortality rate is over 50% for cases of poisoning. So it's not just Parkinson's. In terms of chronic exposure, there's several other very significant conditions. And just getting back to the understanding of what link there is and how we can establish it. So when you're considering if a substance is contributing to the cause of a disease, it's imperative that there's actually a plausible biological mechanism. And this certainly exists with paraquat and PD. And it's interesting, historically, in 1983, there was a cluster of cases of acute or subacute Parkinson's coming on over days to weeks, or to less than a week, in a group of 7 young adults in California who'd all had a batch of modified intravenous heroin. And analysis of the underlying toxic metabolite found a chemical structure of this MPPT that was remarkably similar to paraquat. So similar to paraquat was this structure that it was decided that paraquat became a way of actually inducing and producing rodent models of Parkinson's. And those rodent models have been used and found that it relatively easily crosses the blood-brain barrier and has selective toxicity to the dopaminergic cells that Roger showed you in the substantia nigra. In some rodent models of low-dose chronic inhalation, there's damage to the olfactory regions at the front of the brain. And so it looks like it lines up pretty well. There's been some criticism of some of the animal work for not necessarily being representative of what happens in the humans. For example, there's one criticised study where they injected it straight into the abdominal cavity. Turning to epidemiological studies, there's many of these that go back to the 1980s, and the methods which have been used to generate the data have been difficult and tricky. Quite often there's been the use of patient questionnaires where the person tries to think about what they'd been exposed to, in fact, many years ago, and that opens the studies up to some degree of uncertainty. One of the ways of trying to make sense of lots of smaller studies is to clump them together, and we've seen the meta-analyses of various other conditions, aspects of Parkinson's over the last couple of days. But there are several meta-analyses of Parkinson's and paraquat that have actually indicated an overall risk of perhaps of up to 2.5 times. And that association, as we heard from Laurie this morning, doesn't necessarily infer causation, her example of the high heels and breast cancer, but in consideration with other aspects, including the animal models, I think we need to take that into account. The pivotal study and I think perhaps the most important study that's been announced in the last few years came out in February of last year and was from California. And what they did, they looked at a study called the PD Environment and Gene Study, which is a case control study with 829 Parkinson's patients in 3 well-defined areas, 3 specific counties in mid-California. And they've got the advantage of having very good records of pesticide use. They have the Californian Department of Pesticide Regulation keeps track of commercially used pesticides, including what type of crop, what type of pesticide, when, and most interestingly, how much is used. And they're actually able to calculate in pounds per square yard the actual dose of paraquat. And they then looked at, there was a link to home and work addresses of people with and without Parkinson's, and they were able to determine positive associations with all these key things such as the duration, the intensity, and most importantly, the proximity. And they were able to look at people who didn't work with paraquat, but they lived less than 500 metres away from where it had been used, and they clearly had an increased risk. And the impact of this paper has actually been very important, and Baz Bloom editorialised it towards the end of last year, and his opinion was that the importance of this study has really tipped the balance in the assessment of the causation. And so Baz has very kindly given us a little message here. Oh no, it's not playing.
My name is Paul.
Who's?
At Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, the other side of the planet. And I'm here today to speak to you a little bit about Parkinson's and the role of the environment. Paraquat is beyond discussion. I'm convinced it's a cause of Parkinson's. Get rid of it now.
It's a pity you didn't hear his attempt at an Australian accent actually at the start. So if I get a chance, I'll rewind it. It's quite interesting. The full 7-minute video is available at the Pesticides Australia stand that Josh and Bruce are running out at the back, and he's got some very interesting messages. And one of the things that irks me tremendously about what's happened with paraquat and the Parkinson's issue is that somehow, for us to change the status quo, the onus has fallen to science to prove that there's a causal link, that paraquat is actually causing harm, which is completely the wrong way around, because usually in science, particularly in medicine and health, if we're going to be using a substance in humans, you have to go through all the preclinical work and expense and all the safety data to prove something safe before you can use it. So the precautionary principle is about flipping the prerogative back to where it should have been all along, which is that the proponents of paraquat should have to prove that it's safe, which is much aligned with how we usually practice. The situation in Australia is that even though it's banned in 70 other countries, it remains in widespread use, and particularly in the large-scale farms that we have here. The overseeing body is the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Association, Authority, and I did invite the CEO to attend today, but he had other commitments. It's been on their radar. Paraquat and diquat, which is a cousin of paraquat, been under review since '97, and the specific look at neurotoxicity in 2016, they looked at the animal studies, and the one that I mentioned before about the intraperitoneal injection was one of the reasons they were a little bit against the that animal studies. They also claimed that amongst the survivors of paraquat poisoning, they couldn't find any cases of Parkinson's, and they all thought the epidemiological studies were not robust. So they were been a bit reluctant to come to any conclusion that paraquat was harmful. And many of you in this room may have come across this fantastic book by some of the world leaders in Parkinson's, and it came out in just as COVID was coming, and you might know it was actually originally supposed to be called the Parkinson's Pandemic, and I think they'd even printed a few copies of it before with that title before the COVID struck, so they changed the name. But the very first recommendation they have for actions to reduce the global burden of Parkinson's is to ban paraquat and trichloroethylene. So trichloroethylene is disappearing out of use. It's been banned by the EPA in the US last year, and paraquat we still struggle on. So back in 2021, this kind of got me fired up, and I wrote to the APVMA explaining that this is suggestions to ban paraquat, and because of its links to Parkinson's and other health issues, was now really being supported by some of the global experts. And they wrote back saying, oh, well, we're undertaking another review, and it'll be out at the end of this year, i.e. 2021. And so it took a bit longer than we expected, and it finally came out in July of 2024. And I very keenly opened it and rushed quickly to the section on neurotoxicity, and here's what it said in the bold: the overwhelming weight of evidence is that paraquat does not induce neurotoxicity. And I was a bit stunned, frankly, and I seriously thought that the "not" was a typo, and but no, it wasn't. And the way it's all worded, it's very unclear if the conclusion's just pertaining to the experimental data or to the total body of evidence. Even just from a basic grammatical perspective, I can't understand how they've used the word overwhelming, because as I've briefly shown you, there are key studies, and as I've said, that even though not all of them have shown associations, many have. So to use the term overwhelming is plainly wrong. And when I compare the 2024 report to 2016, there's not really much difference. And quite incredibly, that very robust Californian study that I referred to was not included. Several of the major meta-analyses were not included. I looked at their references. There's 550 references, and only 50 of them are from this century. And so perhaps it's a good thing that the CEO is not here, because the report just really seems to come up very short, and it's missing a lot of things. And it doesn't appear, and I've been unable to find the people who actually did the review, and whether or not there was actually any experts in human health involved. The APVMAs really have scientists and veterinarians. Not to criticise the scientists, but this is a human health issue, and you'd think that human health experts should really be involved. To add more fuel to the fire, in a month or so later, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, or ABC, aired a story on its landline program. And this featured a cluster of potato families in northern Victoria who all had substantial exposures to paraquat. It showed some aerial footage, or some black and white footage of crop dusting planes flying over fields with the farmers with no protection at all, guiding the planes to where to spray the crops. The story also included a section where the journalist raised some allegations that the manufacturer of paraquat, a giant company, Syngenta, had suppressed research done by its very own scientists that had actually found a link to Parkinson's. And that the company had actively tried to undermine the research by independent scientists who'd also reported the link. And this really stirred the pot so much that the issue was raised in the federal parliament. And there was some degree of criticism of the ABC's for allegedly sensationalising the story, but the Commonwealth Ombudsman actually cleared them of that. A week later, the Fight Parkinson's group from New South Wales has on their regular Ask the Experts webinar, had one of my colleagues, Wes Vassison, he's a neurologist from Victoria and movement disorder specialist. He was actually featured in that ABC story, and they had pictures of him visiting the farms and giving a public lecture. Wes himself has a farm in Victoria, and he was a bit stunned when he found out his neighbour was using paraquat, and that really sparked his interest in the topic. And as a movement disorder specialist, he'd already come across quite a number of his Parkinson's patients who were farmers. So these events have triggered a lot of interest in people with Parkinson's and the advocacy groups, including, of course, Parkinsons Australia. And in response, Parkinsons Australia undertook they took out a statement strongly supporting a ban, and opened a campaign to encouraging the public and relevant groups to make submissions. The APVMA had opened their report to public comments up until October 31st last year, and through Parkinsons Australia, we've gained some 10,000 signatures at the time of me doing this slide. I think it's actually a little bit further up. The final number was about 11,600. There are approximately 150 submissions sitting with the APVMA at the moment, and I've been told that the final analysis of all this information will be sometime towards the end of this year. I myself made a much stronger submission than what I did in 2021. Rather than going solo this time, what I did is I tried to garner the support of my colleagues from the clinical neurology and neuroscience field, and I brought my colleagues up to date with the report, a link to the landline story and the important Californian study, and Baz kindly sent an early look at his editorial, which I sent around as well. And I made it simple for my colleagues. I suggested three things: that to overturn the decision to continue to support the use of paraquat, that the government help to phase it out in a planned fashion, and also provide some economic support for changing agricultural practice. And there's only about 55 neurologists in Western Australia, and I was able to get in contact with most of them. Wes did a similar thing for his submission in Victoria. We also hassled our peak professional bodies to make sure they made a statement. But I was also very happy to get some support from the PD Avengers group from Canada. And the three gentlemen down here, you'll recognise Baz and Michael Ocon and Ray Dorsey. Ray's really been one of the flag bearer for environmental toxins and their link to Parkinson's, and Ray and Michael kindly signed this letter directly to the APVMA. And there are even more people as well, of course. The article in Movement Disorders with 11 different authors from mainly Europe and North and South America. This is a bit beyond paraquat. It was actually looking at pesticides in general, air pollution and trichloroethylene, and really looked in detail at the evidence supporting causality, and their conclusions have been yes for all those three. So what I'd like to see is that there's an end to the uncertainty about a link with causation of Parkinson's and chronic human health, because if the users of paraquat are continually hearing this message that there's no harm, you can expect that they are going to be a bit lax with their use. I mean, there are strict regulations about how it's handled and the training that people should have. And the APVMA, their very own caveat about their conclusions is that it's provided that the product is used as directed. And if people have not got incentive to think it's not unsafe, it's human nature not to be so cautious. But if we are to really be firm on this and say, look, this is definitely linked to chronic health problems, then you can imagine that there'll be some more vigilance. Despite learning all this about paraquat, I've always felt a bit uncomfortable about suggesting a ban, so I thought I'd delve into it a little bit more deeply. And I just felt a bit embarrassed thinking, here I am, it might be for me to recommend to farmers about stopping one of their major tools might be like them saying to me, well, you shouldn't be using MRI. In order to really try and get a bit more cred, and my brother and I actually took a road trip back to our where we'd spent those 3 years in the country in October last year, and we visited a couple of farms run by some schoolmates, and on one it was quite easy to find the paraquat in 1,000-litre containers, but you also found it in this little scruffy small container with a Sharpie written on it, and so it's clearly not the container it's supposed to be used for, and it looks like it's been slopped all about. At the second farm, we had a really good in-depth discussion with a farmer who was not a paraquat user, and he described some of the techniques. I thought they'd actually put that the right way round, but this is me in the canola field. I'll see if I can. Should be able to just give it a click on the thing, and it shows me in the canola field and the farmer's pointing out. So this is at a corner between two fields, and there's three different sorts of invading grasses trying to get into the crop. So there are generations of farmers, particularly from the 1950s and 60s, who went through a period where they started to use chemicals such as paraquat, and there's a dramatic increase in their yields as a result of this, and it enabled them to use what's called a no-tillage seeding, which means they could just put the seeds on the ground without having to plough them in, and that obviously made things a lot easier, and the farms became very, very profitable. And this is an advert from Syngenta, and you can see that they're very keen to promote the long-term use of their product, which is got huge value to them. And it might seem why are the current farmers still opposed to making a change in practice. I've spoken to several farmers who genuinely believe that banning paraquat and glyphosate in Australia and the US, in combination with reduced grain production from the Ukraine, could potentially have a catastrophic fall in grain production and lead to widespread famine. So there's very good reasons why they're worried. And there's a lot of pressures, of course, on the farming world at the moment with the live sheep ban. And there are any change in practice has got some implications environmentally. If they return to tilling the soil, that exposes it to more erosion. If they move their mix of grain and livestock towards more livestock, there's more greenhouse gas emissions. So there are flow-on effects from any of these decisions. Interestingly, from an economic perspective, there's a Deloitte's Access Economics report back in 2013, which concluded that if banning glyphosate and paraquat together would cost $362 million per year by 2025. And interestingly and coincidentally, the following year there was a similar report that looked at the economic impact of Parkinson's disease on the Australian economy. And at that stage, the figure was $1.1 billion per year, and undoubtedly, I suspect that's probably even doubled by now. So the reason for showing that is that if there's going to be any cost to changing economic practice, your agricultural practice, this really needs to be lined up against potentials for savings in health. And in fact, the data that's been collected around the world in areas that have made a change away from using paraquat is that it may not necessarily actually come at a cost. And there's the Parkinsons, the Pesticides Action Network from the UK has published on this just a year or so ago, and they've looked at what's happened to grain yields and farming income in about a dozen different countries before and after bans of paraquat. And interestingly, didn't find that there was a problem. The lead author of this, Alex Stewart is his name, has actually been has answered a number of my emails and has been very informative. And this is just a slide from their website that illustrates it's not just agriculture we're talking about, the impact. It's health, it's economies, and its impact on water, soil and air quality. So there's really some key environmental issues that are linked to all of this. The Parkinsons, the Pesticides Action Network from the UK even had a little special on Australia, and they compared the amount of pesticide products here compared with the UK's, and you can see how much more we use chemicals. They also point out that the purity of our the other economic factor that people here probably haven't realised is that the Europe and the UK, when they're looking at imports, Australian grain has now been looked at as being contaminated and dirty, and they're looking really for other markets. So if we continue with the status quo, the value of our trade will continue to decline. And so they regard our produce as dirty and unclean. I'm going to finish by suggesting a few things about how Australia could use less pesticides and make cleaner and healthier grains. The current West Australian of the Year is actually jointly held by a husband and wife team, Ian and Di Haggerty, and they've been recognised for they are amazing, and they've been recognised for their pioneering methods using fertiliser-free and pesticide-free farming techniques. And they use a number of different approaches, but one of the core things is this fantastic compost that they make out of hay and sheep manure and worm juice. And I'm a shocking gardener, so my worm farm always failed. My compost tumble was never any good, but they're doing this on a massive scale, and they've been able to demonstrate that they've been able to use these techniques without pesticides and have excellent crop results in low rainfall areas of less than 200 mils per year. And so they're really leading the way. And we've also got Bruce Maynard in the audience, who's had similar sort of work in New South Wales. And the focus really of this is about, it comes back to the soil microbiome. And we've heard about the microbiome and the impact on our gut and the relationship between Parkinson's disease. And we've heard about our foods being contaminated, and we've seen the Dirty Dozen list. And so this all, as I was hearing this morning from Laurie, I thought, oh wow, this just all follows on so logically. And I've been speaking with Di and Ian every couple of weeks since last year, working out a way how we can align our respective interests and causes which clearly overlap, And when I get back to Perth, I'm going to be speaking to the Doctors for Environment group there and considering how we can move this all forward. The Haggertys and I believe the best way to do this is to bring experts together from all the different fields, from health, from agriculture and environment, and we're currently seeking some support from some prominent WA philanthropists to assist with a meeting we're hoping to plan in September with these groups, half in Perth and half up at the farms. In the meantime, the APVMA decision is still pending, and they tell me, like I said before, perhaps towards the end of the year. And what I'd like to see is hopefully, at a bare minimum, acknowledge that there is good evidence for paraquat having a causal role in PD and to alert our frontline workers. I have to say I'm not particularly optimistic that they're going to recommend a ban. There's just so many other factors swirling around at the moment. Like I said, the live sheep export, the tariffs. But I think even if a ban is not recommended, we could still make progress by working together, as I've said. It's interesting that up until just recently, at a government level, the issue really seems to have been recognised only in the agricultural sphere. And I know for a fact that the Federal Minister of Health was not aware of the issue until the end of last year. And my local federal member actually assisted me by relaying the concerns to him. And his response was, "Oh, check with the APVMA." So this whole issue is enormous. I mean, the reason I think I've become so interested in it is I can just see that this issue is an issue that's beyond Parkinson's disease. It's not just about us reducing Parkinson's, it's about improving the quality of food for everyone. And if we don't do something about this, the whole health of the planet and the people are going to be at risk. So I think this is an ideal opportunity to draw these different areas of expertise together and hopefully improve the health for everyone. So thank you.